Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes, and rejoining us today is our old friend, although he's not that old, John Breen, back home from a teaching stint in northern Michigan. We begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you've taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Our focus today is South America. Co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes has just returned from his travels to South America, and he's going to field for us, I'll bet he'll do it well, a whole list of questions. And the questions begin close to home, or I should say close to his homeland, Paraguay. What's the political reality there, Mario?
Well, good morning, everyone. How can I start? Over the past week, Paraguay, which is a democratic country in the sense there has been elections since 1989, has been pretty much stable on that front, even though it has had some political crisis over the past 20 years, went through very delicate political crisis because the president, almost a week ago, was almost impeached by Congress. So he was accused of, and his vice president was accused of being part of a so-called secret deal with Brazil, a neighboring country, regarding the provision of energy from an hydroelectric plant, which is at the border of both countries. So the situation was very delicate because it appeared that some people in government made a deal without informing Congress about how was the deal made. And well, the Congress reacted and threat with impeachment. They had the votes. They were already writing the accusation in front of Congress, and then there was an arrangement made by the president with the president of Brazil, which stated that they will be not take into account that deal and begin again a new negotiation. So the intervention precisely, I think, of the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, saved the president from the impeachment. So Paraguayan Congress decided to stop the proceedings and let him go, so to speak. Nevertheless, the crisis triggered by this attempt of backroom deal still is alive and well. And given the fact that the current president was elected almost a year ago and still have 5 years to go, the presidential term is 5 years, is not a good deal. It's not a good news regarding the country as a whole. Even though doesn't mean that there will be a coup d'etat, there will be any interruption. That's not the point. The point is that he may go again some political crisis because he has no majority in Congress. It's an emergency democracy and go through different economic challenges. So that was, I think, my experience over the past month while visiting Paraguay.
Were you able to discuss the, as you say, delicate situation with friends of the president and with critics of the president, or was there not a whole lot of discussion going on, just some power plays?
Well, I talked to a few people, and the information that we got, that I got, was confusing regarding the deal made by the government. So, because there is some kind of division within or between the president and the vice president. So, we don't have at this point a clear information as to what really happened. And so the opposition, of course, was outraged about the deal. And I talked to some deputies from the Liberal Party, which is an opposition party, and they were, I think, justly enraged by this deal. But the issue there, I think, is lack of transparency. There is no clear system of accountability, much less political accountability, because if one of the things that we learn, or I think the Latin American New Democracy of Paraguay learned, is that democracy as a system is very fragile, it's very weak, and it needs to be strengthened through civic participation, sound moral principles. And so when you are coming out of a long period of dictatorship, you don't have these values in place, and you need to rebuild all this moral fabric in that society. And so the democratic system in Paraguay still is building this foundation, so to speak, which was undermined by 60 years of dictatorship. So much so that one of the issues as well, which was this impeachment issue and was very delicate, was a fight in the Senate chamber between two senators. And so, like a ring, they were fighting physically between the two about some accusation, mutual accusation between them, so that they were not able to deal with that difference by arguing, by persuasive presentation of the issues. So that shows in very visible way that at the heart of the system, there is still a lack of civic understanding in how democracy works. I think it's better now than 20 years ago, but still there is a long way to go.
How about comparing your home country, Paraguay, with the broader situation of democratic regimes in South America? Would you say it's quite comparable, or would you say Paraguay is more precarious? How you go from your country to a whole continent? I know there are big differences, but maybe we could look at some of them as well.
That's a good question. If you compare, let's say, which one of the South American country is better off in terms of economic development, political stability, civic virtue, etc., I would say, without doubt, that is Chile. Chile probably is the most stable politically. It is the most developed economically, where accountability of public official is very clear. There has been since the year 1986, more or less, when began the transition from the Pinochet dictatorship, that two major political parties, or three now, political party became to be part of the government every presidential term up to our time, and so much so that Chile is really independent, even in how the country is open to the world. They have free trade agreement from with all the Latin American countries, with all European countries, with all the Asian countries, and the standard of living in Chile is very high. And so that's if you compare with Paraguay, there is there is a visible difference there in terms of that quality of democracy. Now, the same thing, or close, perhaps, you may say about Uruguay, which is another country, but on the east coast of South America, which is smaller than Paraguay, smaller than Chile, which also has had a long period of stability since 1975, late 70s, when the democratic process began, and has been a social democratic party and a conservative party getting into office and in a different time period, and also economically and politically has been very stable, and in that sense is much better the quality of democratic systems than Paraguay, even though it's smaller, has fewer conflicts, so to speak, than Paraguay. Now, if you move to a different country, such as, let's say, Argentina, financially, Argentina is in worse shape than Paraguay. The deficit of the state, so to speak, is huge, and Argentina, if you know, has been through the presidencies in 2000 approximately up to 2017 of a populist Peronista left-wing administration, which introduced a set of policy which led Argentina close to bankruptcy. And that populism was widespread with all the clientelism that follow this type of way of governing. They were part of a tacit and explicit agreement between the government of Venezuela, at that point was Hugo Chavez, and some populist government in Ecuador, etc. So in that sense, Argentina now, since 2-3 years ago, regained a different model of development, tried to somehow get rid of this system, paternalistic state system, with a new leadership, which has not been quite successful, yet the inflation rate is quite high. The dollar is not very stable, and yet the new president, Macri, which is an engineer, managed to go in a different direction, which we may call technically in Latin America as desarrollista. In other words, he tried to develop the local industries and somehow shrink a little bit the state control of the economy, even though he's not what we may call an orthodox liberal in the sense that goes through the liberalization, privatization. So he's in the middle of the road, so to speak, and yet he has not been quite successful in many ways. What makes very worrisome for some people in Latin America right now about Argentina is that the election or the possible re-election of the current president Macri is is in doubt now, and the first primary will be next this month, actually, at the end of August. See, if he doesn't get re-elected, then the all Peronista party may come and be back. And so, and one of the candidates for vice president of the Peronista is precisely Cristina Kirchner, who was the former president, who is accused and is indicted of corruption and embezzlement and many other crimes. So that make Argentina in a very delicate situation. So in that sense, Paraguay has more stability, even though it's a smaller economy. But still, the trade with Argentina and Paraguay is affected by this Argentina instability at this point.
All right, now, Mario, you've got three countries that you've compared with Paraguay. One looks to be doing very well, Chile. One fairly well, Paraguay, and one in a very difficult situation, Argentina. Let me ask you this, and I'm going to start with Chile. What has been the foundation for the development and the success of Chile? What made that possible?
There is a tradition in Chile which began probably back in the late 30s of a most robust understanding of politics. By that, I mean that they were able to build coalitions since early 30s and also continue after the First World War, which affected Latin America in many ways. With the advent of what was called the conservative tradition, and then that tradition became to be known as Christian democratic tradition in Chile. You may remember that in 1938, 39, Eduardo Frei, was a young leader then, wrote a book which the title is La Política y el Espíritu, The Spirit and Politics, which was a roadmap of this new way of dealing with politics. Now, making a long story short, that movement seized power, was elected through different stages in the 60s. And yet, by 1965, Chile was pretty much a political regime, stable, with public participation, with some economic development and in international investment, was what we may call a middle of the road democratic ideology. In other words, it was not statist. The state was not in charge of the economy, neither was the private sector. There was a kind of middle of the road, and certain agreement with certain investor, guided by what Frey called revolution in liberty. Revolution in the sense they want change, but at the same time they respect the freedom of the market in order to make investment and so on.
Then came Allende.
Right. And then that led to the election, which was not an election based on the majority for some very complicated legislative provision. Allende, which was influenced by himself by the way of the left, the Marxist left, which were coming from Cuba, which was permeated many movements in Latin America, was elected. Well, that led to a set of policies and complication and what I call discontinuity with this policy of Frey, so much so that led to the coup d'etat in September of 73. And then you have the dictatorship of Pinochet, which, yes, violated human rights, was brutal. The persecution, we were in Latin America was involved in the Cold War with all the ups and downs. And so, but at the same time, there was some policies and in terms of economics policy, which were giving protagonism to the private sector. The state did not take over the economy as many other military junta did. And so, parallel to the political dictatorship, there was at one point a flourishment of the market economics. In some sense, that was, I'm just making a very wild comparison, is what we may say, well, that's what China is doing. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know the detail about China, but that's the claim made by some people. Well, they are having a very heavy-handed politically, but at the same time, the economy seems to be flourishing in some ways. So Chile somehow cared at that point about the economic system. But at the same time, slowly, the abuses in human rights led to a very capable social civil society to get back into the political arena through different agreement, and they decided to have a referendum, and then Pinochet lost the referendum. So to make a long story short, Chile came back or went back to reestablish his old democratic system. And so to the new liberties of the new constitution, they were already having a very stable economy. And so when those start matching both, I think, the political regime and freedom of the press, all the institution which we may call part of the long Republican and liberal tradition, along with certain flourishment of free market economics, then you have a formula you can fix here and there, but it's on the path of better times. And so Chile, since, let's say, the 1988 up to today, has been an uninterrupted set of series of good presidents, whether they came from the left. The left means social democrats or socialists in American terms, which social in American terms doesn't mean someone who take over the economy. You had some Christian Democrat president, which also were very careful about governing, respecting human rights and economic initiative, private investment. And then you have some government which are more conservative, but they behave the same way as the others. So there is a implicit agreement about Chile that the system is working. It's not a perfect one, but it's a very reasonable one, and has given a lot of success in terms of in economic terms. And also,
okay, Mario, let me get in an American Solidarity Party question here. Would you say that in the countries in which, well, the received opinion would be there really is a free market, and because there's a free market, there's been economic stability. Would you say those free markets are really free, or is it the case that those markets are dominated by a very few corporations? A person who's been very active in the American Solidarity Party, John Madai, has a helpful introduction to distributism up on the web in the American Solidarity Party has called attention to it. And Madai's point is that much better to speak of or aim for a free market than capitalism, but problem with the free market is so often, maybe after a period of time, but so often it doesn't come to be very free at all. And it's really the case that in any one area, there are two or maybe three major corporations that control the economy. So, question is, how free is the free market when the free market is at least operating over and against a completely socialist economy? How free does the free market really get? Well, what do you think?
Let me say, if you measure according to some standard, it is said that Chile has a 75 place among the freest economy in the world, which is not very, it's not one of the first places, which it means that it's middle of the road. How many of that freedom is managed by large corporations? I don't know. I don't think it's something that serious political actor in Chile worry much about, because the idea is how to attract investment. So how to build the industrial base, how to recreate the production, how to make the economy really works, and that is you can provide job for the population. So I would say the policy of the government, regardless the political persuasion, is generally more friendly, business-friendly policies. And so they will, with that, try to keep or maintain the long record of sound macroeconomic policy making. In other words, they say, well, we need to keep this growth. Now, how then this growth spill over to the citizen with their difficulties in their daily life? So generally, in Latin America has been the case that you can reach to the family, so to speak, the individual in his need or her need through some policies, which make the state still a protagonist of policy making. It's not that, well, we are going to let only the big corporation and the big business to run the show here. Rather, the state still has a role in every single country. Even Chile, which probably is one of the freest in that sense. So there are, let's say, in education, a budget managed by the state in order to provide public education for those who are in dire need. So the state set up these policies. Now, there's difference between setting policies with money which you can get from the general budget and from taxes. That's different from providing public employment through state agencies to the client of your political party, which has been the case of some populist political systems in Latin America, such as the populism in Argentina of Peronismo, has been the policy in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, has been in policy in some system, at least some political persuasion in Paraguay. So I do believe that in that sense, there is still a notion, even though they don't say explicitly, but there is a notion of what we may call the common good. This is some good common to all, and we need to deal with that because the goods are not going to be delivered exclusively by the market. And I think that is implicit in the Socialist Party in Chile, and also in the most conservative country, which is the one which is in power today with President Piñera.
Let me ask this then, since we're speaking now of the common good. Does the Catholic Church still have cultural and political influence in particular, let's say, Paraguay, Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina? What's the position there in the discussions and the policy formation? What role does the Catholic Church play?
The question is a little difficult to answer because there are too many differences between those countries regarding the influence of the Catholic Church. Now, let me start by saying this. The Catholic Church has lost influence since the 1980s and has lost immensely. If you examine Paraguay and you take as a milestone the visit of John Paul II in 1988, who made clear to the dictator at that time was the sense of democratic values that any political system has to have in order to defend human rights, and that was part of the Catholic social teaching, and he said that in front of the dictator. Up to today, and how powerful that speech was, which in some people, in some instances, that speech led to a year or so after that, the speech was, or the homily was speech and homily, thus was said in 1988 when he visited in May. By a year after that, there was a coup d'etat against that dictator. And the coup d'etat, a violent coup d'etat, was made, among other things, on behalf of the Catholic faith. Not the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith. That was the one of the banners of the general who led the coup d'etat. So the influence of the church in Paraguay was widespread. The bishop then was a beloved bishop whose word was followed faithfully. And I think that was one of the reasons why the dictator, after John Paul II visited, did not really, was not able to keep things going anymore. So there was a huge awareness of that. Now, after that, has passed 30 some years. During this time, there was with the democratic process, the new freedoms and the pluralism, the new ideas, the introduction through the enjoyment of freedom of secularist ideas in the public arena, the influence of the church or the values brought about by the gospel were lost in many quarters, in political parties and many institutions. So today, because of this process of secularization, if you want to use this term, the influence of the Conference Bishop in Paraguay is almost it's very weak. Is very almost without people don't notice much. And so in that sense, there has been a weakening of the faith and the influence of the Catholic Church. So much so that what the church says in many aspects, people don't pay much attention. Now, what is the reason of that? Well, then the process of secularization and also the influence that has had over this perception of the church through the abuses that took place in different countries in Latin America and in Paraguay in some cases. And so the credibility of the church has been completely weakened, to say, to use this word. And in that sense, just give an example. In 1990, when the first free election after the coup d'etat, which restored democracy in Paraguay, took place, the Paraguayan Christian Democratic Party, which was coming out of the catacombs, so to speak, was legalized for the first time, was legal for the first time. They ran for office. They have a presidential candidate. They have for Chamber of Deputies, Chamber for the Senate. So they got, I think, almost 20,000 votes, which was pretty much good for a country, for a political party which came from the shadows, from almost extinction. Overnight, it exploded. Now, today, 5 years ago or so, the Christian Democratic Party has no parliamentary representation, which is almost politically non-existent. So that shows you the degree to which the undermine of this memory affected Paraguay. In other words, the influence of any idea of the Catholic social teaching over politics is very weak. It's kept in certain groups, but this group has no political influence as they used to. Now,
that's a really powerful and particular example of how there can be this major change. Do Christian thinkers there have any strategy for changing things in a different direction, for bringing back or renewing Christian democracy? Is there any kind of discussion center for that?
Well, just another point. You asked me about Argentina. Now, yes. Argentina is more complicated, even.
More complicated. All right.
In what sense? To what extent the church? When I use the church, we need to be very careful. To what extent the idea of the Catholic social teaching are somehow immersed in the political movement in Argentina. By political movement, I say, well, on the quote-unquote right, which is not right in the sense as is not conservative in economics, is more desarrollista, is more interventionist in the economy. So this this tradition in Argentina is pretty much anti-clerical. By anti-clerical means they are not anti-church per se, but they are pushing the despenalization of abortion. They are pushing all the new rights, whether reproductive right or any other ideas that you can get from most secularized group in the United States. And so in that sense, there is nothing there that tell us or tell you that they are pushing some Catholic Christian tradition ideas overall, perhaps in some very particular aspect of the economy, how to help to neighborhood, how to set public policy to help the poor. In that sense, maybe resemble some idea of subsidiarity and so on and so forth. But not because the influence of the church of subsidiarity ideas into that policy. Rather, that is coming from their own views of things society as these ideologies see those issues. Now, if you move to the populist movement, the Peronista Front, now you find there huge differences between the political actors. You find right now the current candidate for president in Argentina, populist Peronist party, which is openly pro-abortion. And he's setting some policies that are completely against the Catholic tradition. And I'm saying that because the Peronista party was claimed by other Peronistas to be the party of, quote unquote, the church, the party which has kept Catholic social teaching alive. Now, that may be true in a very tiny group within the party, particularly in some priests, which they call the priests of Shantytown, who help the poor and so on in the very in cooperative and different way of associating the poor and so on. But overall, the two movements are moved, so they are proposing their ideas, not because of the Catholic social teaching, rather than the political dynamics of the time. In that sense, also, it's painful for me to say, but the influence of the Catholic Church is minimum in political terms, and that's a sea change, I think, in Argentina over the past 30 years. That was not the case in the 1980s, much less the case in the 60s or 70s. The church always was present in political movement, either favoring one movement or another, but affecting everything. And also the voice of the bishop was heard. Today yes, they speak loudly, but not many people pay attention.
All right, now let's turn to the most difficult situation in South America, and you've referenced it maybe once or twice. What about Venezuela? Bring us up to date on that. We've had a discussion on the Open Door with regard to Venezuela. In fact, one of our discussants has declined to rejoin us because he thinks that what he has to say falls on deaf ears. What about Venezuela? We've talked about 4 countries in some detail, but we haven't really at all addressed Venezuela. Now, let's focus on that. What's your view?
Well, the situation is pretty much the same as it was 6 months ago in general terms. By that, I mean Maduro is still in power. He seems to be in charge of the government himself, even though he is somehow holding there, backed up by the army, and then perhaps the second or third man, Padrinos General, who also is backing him. There has been rumors, there are differences there how to approach, and the interference of the influence of Cuban people within the regime. That's on the one hand, and on the other, Guaidó, the interim president of the assembly, continue championing a new model of democracy, claiming that he is the true president. That big picture did not change. In other words, all the attempts by the Organization American State, by the Latin American country which are supporting Guaidó, so much in order to force Maduro to leave, were unsuccessful. In that sense, the power is still in place. Now, there was one, I think, feature, perhaps two, which is changing somehow the dynamic. In what sense? A month ago or so, the High Commissioner of the United Nations, Michelle Bachelet, who is herself former president of Chile twice. She's social democrat. She is, quote unquote, from the left. She visited the country. She visited every single place that claimed to be places where human rights were violated. During the visit, she said not much. She recorded everything she saw. She left the country, and then a week after that, she published a report about the really horrible situation in terms of human rights of the Maduro regime. So that was I think, a game changer in the sense that everyone thought that Mrs. Bachelet was about to give a blank check to the ideological, seems very close relation between her views about politics and Maduro, which I think is not the case. But so the reaction of the regime was was expected. They were furious and accused her of conspiracy and all that. So so with that, I think Maduro regime lost the blessing, if you will, of the United Nations, at least of that that department or that institution of the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. That made the regime even more isolated, but not much change in terms of political power. Now, there were other issues, another issue perhaps that some people may not notice. There was a couple of attempts between Guaido group and Maduro group to negotiate some political way of dealing with the crisis. The first one was, I think, a couple of talks they held in Europe, where Guaido sent his representative, and also the government sent representative, and they talk about possible negotiation about how to deal with the crisis. That talk ended in nothing. And then there was another attempt in Barbados recently, again, a talk between the government and the opposition, or the parallel government, to reach to some agreement. And that the result were completely also, it was a failure. And so that make the regime even more isolated. And so that is the situation right now. Now, the popularity of Guaido remained the same. It has not grown much, but remained the same. And he is visibly the majority of the people. Now, if you read the report of the High Commissioner of the United Nations about human rights abuses, is really horrible in the description and numbers and people tortured and political prisoners and all that. In that sense, it's a stalemate. The economy continue deteriorating in the country. People continue fleeing the country, but the opposition has no way to have access to power. Now, what would be the other alternative? That is the question that Latin America in general has said, well, we don't want to use force here, even though there are a lot of violation of human rights. And that is what is happening. There's no intervention, at least military intervention of any type yet, from the United States.
All right, now, Mario, let me interject here. I think you've brought us up to date on the basic position in Venezuela. Suppose our friend Matt Cooper had decided to join us. And I'm going to try to present his position, and I know I'm going to do so in a very incomplete way. But I want to try to present his position, and then after I present his position, I'm going to call on our friend John Breen and ask him an epistemological question. He's a recent graduate and he knows about epistemology, and I'm going to ask him to take the role of the man on the street dealing with an epistemological question. All right, so first up, Matt Cooper. Suppose he says something like this. Of course, Mario, you can cite generally Western criticism of Maduro, and a lot of people have heard that criticism, and a lot of people are generally sympathetic to that criticism. But what a lot of people don't have any exposure to whatsoever is the support for Maduro that comes from places like China and places like Russia and places like maybe, I don't know, some of the Middle Eastern countries. And so because they're not listening to what all of those sources have to say, they don't appreciate, somebody like Matt Cooper might say, they don't appreciate that what's really happening that's most decisive, most fundamental in Venezuela is that there's a soft coup. As you say, there hasn't been a military coup, although no doubt there's been some backroom discussions of how there could be a military coup, but there's been a soft coup, and the soft coup involves sanctions, economic sanctions, and more economic sanctions, and more economic sanctions. So that what we're seeing in Venezuela is really, and this goes from the Chavez period forward to where we are now, a kind of economic strangulation of what could be, of course it hasn't been, but how would you fare if you were being strangled economically? An economic strangulation of a fundamentally popular country. And of course there have been, now 3-4 million people that have suffered directly because they've had to flee the country. But that's because of Western pressures. All right, so let's suppose something like that is the case made by somebody like Matt Cooper. And again, we wish he were back with us. Now, suppose you have an eminently fair-minded person like John Breen. And John Breen says, I don't know, I want to be eminently fair-minded, but I can't read all the publications from all around the world about what's happening in Venezuela. And because I can't read all the publications from all around the world about what's happening in Venezuela, to be eminently fair, I have to say I'm probably only hearing one side of the story. And I think a great many people who aren't so eminently fair as, say, John would say something like, damn politicians, I'm more sympathetic to our guys than to their guys, but damn politicians. Why can't we have something more like Puerto Rico, where it's clear that everybody is against the government and the governor resigns in a few days? Why can't we have something decisive? Why are we stuck, and how can we possibly be asked to help Venezuela unstick itself? Well, hell's bells, we can hardly figure out what's going on in Joliet, Illinois. Now, I can't ask Matt if I misrepresented him, but maybe I could ask John. John, is there any way you can get the kind of background knowledge you need to really take a position on something that's as far away as Venezuela?
Well, I'll tell you. I think I told you guys last summer, I went to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I attended Acton University. And it's basically like a 3-day conference featuring lots of different speakers. But one of the speakers that we listened to, this was over dinner, so it's a huge auditorium they had on the projector there, and they were interviewing this lady who is a politician from Venezuela. And it was all done in secret. We didn't even know who was going to be featured that night, and that was for security reasons, because the less the government knows, the better, especially when it comes to cyberspace. But she's part of the opposition there, and this was last summer. This was last June, thereabouts, and that's when we got to hear basically directly from her the situation that's going on in Venezuela. And basically the fact that she, as an opposition person, in the opposition party, she's been threatened. She's been threatened with death, threatened with political imprisonment, things like that. Yet she's still continuing her work and continuing to educate the rest of us and everyone at Acton University. It's from 60 countries. So that was almost as good as an eye into Venezuela and trying to understand what is going on there. In regards to Puerto Rico, I personally hope that the people of Venezuela receive some inspiration of a victory that happened there not so far away, and that we can expect the same, hopefully the same action, hopefully the same result going on in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. So. But there is something that does need to be done. From what I have heard, that was the average citizen lost over 30 pounds, which is significant to a human being. Losing 30 pounds due to a shortage of food, that's significant. So something definitely needs to be done. Even the Maduro government should be able to see that there's a crisis going on here. The people are literally starving to death, and that they need to open the gates to receive aid from the world. And hopefully, once we can take care of the people, get their immediate needs met, then they can start discussing the political future of Venezuela.
So there are some things that we should all agree on. Namely, people ought to be able to have enough food to eat. And there are efforts to make that possible in Venezuela, and the very least the government could do would be to accept humanitarian aid. So that's something we can agree on and we can support right now. Is that your position, John?
More or less, yes. I do think the Maduro government is tyrannical and there is a need for regime change. How to go about that? That's going to be a huge process, given the fact that Maduro has the support of major countries abroad, and like you mentioned, China, as well as Russia, and even I think there was one Latin American country that still recognized Maduro. I thought that was Bolivia, but I'm not 100% sure. But I heard newsflash that it was that there were Russian planes that were outfitted for Venezuela, and that they were approaching. I think it was our planes in the air at that time. So Russia is definitely arming the Maduro regime and giving them military aid. We just don't hear too much about humanitarian aid pouring in.
Mario, we're getting close. This always happens to us rats. We're getting close to the end of the hour. How would you respond to especially what John has just said? And how would you address perhaps the epistemological paralysis of the man on the street?
Well, the I do believe that we need to be careful about how we use certain terms without looking at the context in which these terms are being used. You said something soft coup. What does that mean? Soft coup imply that we are engaging, let's say, the opposition in a coup. But the issue is whether or not the regime of Maduro is legitimate. So it's legitimate. The coup is led by him and people who are from Cuba, which is a dictatorship since 1959 to our time. So there is no such a coup, rather than the oppression of people by a regime which has doesn't care about human rights. Now, you can go, any citizen can go to the report of the High Commissioner of the United Nations, which I think is very clear when she said, and she is what we may call a leftist, and she says clearly that there has been arbitrary detention and different forms of torture, electric shock, suffocation with plastic bags, waterboarding, beating, sexual violence, etc., etc. All of them were done by the Maduro regime. Now, granted, we may see the same type of treatment and violation of human rights in China, in Russia. There's no question about it. So the question is, what is the role of Venezuela and Latin America as our neighboring countries for the United States? In other words, are we going to treat this violation the same way we may be treating, quote unquote, in other parts of the world? That's an open question. Are we going to allow in our hemisphere the same mistreatment of our fellow Latin Americans? That's a question that we need to ask. And if we say no, we are not going to tolerate that. We tolerate China because we have any other choice and it's real politics. Perhaps. But my question is, to what extent in our hemisphere we treat one another respecting human rights? The answer given by the Organization of American States is we are not going to tolerate, because that violates any document of the Organization of American States or defend human rights and so on. Now, the question is, what are the means that we have in order to prevent that from happening? Are we going to use force? Now, that word seems that it cannot be used because we still have the guilt of the Cold War. The question is, what do we mean by force? In a Latin American context, perhaps has a different meaning. I was, in 1989, favoring a coup d'etat against a dictatorship who was disappearing people. The Catholic Church was favoring it, bishops. And they led, and they participated, and the revolution was made on behalf of the Catholic people. Is that something against Catholic social teaching? My answer is no. Given the fact that you can get some very narrow justification of just war, uprising, and so on. So I think we need to look at from that perspective, not from a very, I think, very linear view of democracy. The United States is an exceptional country, has never seen a coup d'etat, has never seen violating the Constitution. So Venezuela changed the Constitution in order to justify the dictatorship, and that was done by Chavez. And so what I'm saying is that if we start gathering all these facts here and there, so you are closer to have a diagnosis so that we can have some prescription, if you will, which still is difficult. I understand that because the international context is very somehow in flux today, and we somehow are related to different interests and so on.
Thank you very much,
I'm
Mario.
hoping that
John, yeah, go ahead, please.
just one last note. I'm hoping that if any good is to be brought out of the whole situation in Venezuela, I would say that if anything, that it's serving as a pretty good example of why socialism doesn't work, and that's an argument that that you can use when you're debating your friends or whatnot when they say how socialism is wonderful as an ideology. But in reality, we can point to Venezuela and the crisis going down there and saying that's living example, that's current proof that socialism doesn't work.
I think a distributist and American Solidarity Party person would say, insofar as someone means by socialism state control of everything that really matters, that doesn't work in theory, doesn't work in practice. I think a distributist American Solidarity Party person would say, and if by capitalism you mean that moneyed interests in fact control every aspect of life, that doesn't work either. And that's why have formed a third party. And there's a whole lot of work to be done, intellectual work, analysis of what's going on, and Mario is certainly helping us with that. And also nuts and bolts organization. It's one thing to have the intellectual analysis, and it's another thing to put together candidates who are in fact going to challenge this. One of the things that Mario said is that Christian Democrats in some countries, at any rate in Latin America, and perhaps in all of them, they can't really any longer put together a field of candidates. And that's precisely what we're trying to do, and we're just getting started on it in the United States. Well, more to be said, and more surely will be said. And bienvenido los dos amigos. Mario coming from Paraguay in South America, and John Breen coming from the UP, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, back to Joliet. We end in prayer. This is from today's liturgy, the gospel according to Matthew. Jesus came to his native place and taught the people in their synagogue. They were astonished and said, "Where did this man get such wisdom and mighty deeds? Is he not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother named Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Are not his sisters all with us? Where did this man get all this?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his native place and in his own house." And he did not work many mighty deeds there because of their lack of faith. Thanks again. We'll be back next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.